Hey guys, this video is just to run you through some information about the SAC coming up. The SAC will be on the 8th of May, which is the end of week 4. And I just want to make sure that you have your heads around the rubric and you've had an opportunity to self-assess using the rubric that you'll be graded on. So I'm going to go through the information now with you. So some information for you to start. Your analysis of the written argument will be completed at the end of week 4 on Friday, the 8th of May. So this gives you another week of preparation along with 3 50-minute English lessons that we're going to have together or online together. Keep in mind that all of the tasks we've been completing up until this point are going to assist you in writing your analysis of the written argument. Now, I want to make it really clear, this is not what I would call a big SAC. Of course, it is an important SAC, but it's not a big SAC like how I would describe textual analysis, which requires quite a lot of preparation. This is a little bit different because you've all done persuasive language and techniques throughout middle school. So a lot of students often approach this SAC with a little bit more confidence than they do for, say, textual analysis. You're not learning new skills. I think that's really important to understand. What you're doing is you're developing and you're consolidating skills that you already have. So you need to remember that VCE asks more of you than what was being asked of you in middle school. So of course there are higher expectations, but they're the same skills that you used in middle school to go over persuasive language techniques. So in this video, I'm going to go through all of the rubric criteria with you for this assessment. It's really important that you do this yourself for every single SAC you do in English. You need to know exactly what you're going to be preparing for. For this SAC, I'm going to go over the rubric for you and hopefully give you an understanding of what I mean when I say self-assessment or when I say going over a rubric and understanding a rubric. So we're going to start with the first criteria, which is understanding of the text. Now, the description of a medium grade for this criteria is the following. The student has understood the arguments presented in the text and has explained how the arguments were constructed to appeal to the intended audience. So to get a medium grade, you need to do all of these things above. Show that you understand each of the arguments presented in the text and explain how the arguments are constructed for the intended audience. In order to do this, you must know what the issue is that's being discussed. You must know what the contention of the article is and what the arguments are. You must know and explain who the intended audience is, what the purpose of the text is, and of course, what the context is in which the persuasive text has been written. Now, I'm also going to show you the description of a very low grade, so that's the second one on the list here. The student has understood the arguments presented in the text, but has shown a limited understanding of the argument's construction. The student has not identified the target audience of the text and has made only a basic connection between the argument and the audience. So if you don't tell me how the arguments are constructed or who the intended audience is, or if you show only a limited understanding of the text, so the context, issue, contention, purpose, etc., then you're looking at a very low grade. Now, I'm also going to tell you what the description of a very high grade is as well, so that you get the full scope of the grades that you could achieve. So for a very high grade, a student has to have shown a comprehensive and complex understanding of the arguments presented in the text and how they've been constructed to position the intended audience. So the keywords here are comprehensive and complex. In order to achieve this grade, you would need to consider the arguments and the construction of arguments from all angles. You can't fake it and get a very high grade. This is an option only available to those who study and practice. So our next criteria is analysing the text, or analysing the argument, sorry. Now, a medium grade for this criteria is described as follows. The student has provided an analysis of the arguments that include the discussion of intent and how the author has developed their arguments and used persuasive language in their text. Student has discussed the impact of the text and has provided textual evidence to justify their analysis. So in order to get a medium grade, you must discuss the intent of the author and how they've used language for effect, specifically persuasive language or techniques. You have not only identified persuasive techniques, but you've also told me what effect these techniques are designed to have on the audience. You must use textual evidence to support your analysis. You need to pull out words, phrases, or sentences from the text that support your ideas. Now, again, I've got a very low grade description there for you as well. So for this criteria, a very low grade would look like this. A student has provided a weak analysis of the arguments presented in the text. The student has not discussed the intent of the author or shown an understanding of what impact the arguments would have on the audience. There is minimal textual evidence provided to justify their analysis. I think this description speaks for itself. If you only identify persuasive techniques, but you don't tell me what the impact they're designed to have on the audience is, then you're looking at a very low grade. If you don't mention the intent of the author, or if you don't provide textual evidence to support your analysis, then you're also going to get a very low grade. Now, a very high grade would look like this. The student has offered a sophisticated and insightful analysis of arguments with complex discussions of intent and development of arguments, persuasive use of language, and the impact of the text. The student has provided considered and accurate textual evidence to justify their analysis. Basically, a very high grade is exactly the same as what you would need to do to get a medium grade, only done much better. The key words are sophisticated, insightful, and complex. Considered and accurate evidence must be used. Again, the only real way to achieve this level of developed work is to practice. Now, your third criteria is related to your own skill in writing, which is conventions and language. A medium grade will be achieved when the student has utilized the features of analysis such as structure, conventions, and language in their work. Their analysis is clearly and logically sequenced. The student has used minimal meta-language within their analysis. Now, you must be clear and logical in your presentation of your analysis. Structure is just as important in an analysis as it is in an essay, even though it doesn't follow such strict rules as Peel. You must make sure your analysis is logically sequenced and use appropriate meta-language to analyze the text. Now, meta-language might not be a term that you really understand. It's not a word that people use very often, but all it is a fancy way of describing the appropriate language or vocabulary that people use when they're analyzing something else. So I'm going to give you an example of two different sentences. The first sentence is a sentence that does not use meta-language. Jim doesn't think the Australian government has handled the COVID-19 crisis very well. We know this because he says, "I wish someone else was in power throughout this whole ordeal." Jim thinks that the Australian government was not clear in their explanations of the crisis from the start. So that's the first sentence with no meta-language. This is the same sentence, but with meta-language in the sentence. The author of this article implores the reader to agree with him that the Australian government has not handled the COVID-19 crisis well. He uses a word with the word ordeal to describe the situation, which has negative connotations, and explicitly wishes that someone else was in power. One argument the author makes in support of his contention is that the Australian government was not clear in explaining the crisis to the Australian people. So, some of the things that have changed in here are changed to reflect the meta-language that you would need to use. So, for instance, instead of referring to the author as Jim, the second sentence refers to him as the author of the article. The meta-language that's used in the second sentence indicates the impact that the author is trying to have on the reader. So he implores the reader to agree with him. He uses the word ordeal, and he describes, so in the second sentence, it describes that ordeal has negative connotations, explicitly wishes that someone else was in power. One argument the author makes in support of his contention, that's an important sentence starter. So not only are you telling me what the argument is, you're also telling me that you're about to tell me that it is an argument. So you're showing me that you understand that this point you're making is an argument the author is using to support their main contention. So, like I said, meta-language is something that, although you use it fairly often in English class, you may not have heard that word before, you may not have understood that word before. Most of you will use this sort of language without thinking when you're analysing, and some of you may not be used to it at all. We're going to practice this in the lead up to the SAC, but it's important to think of yourself as a writer too, and as a writer of analysis, you need to use appropriate meta-language for analysis. Now, the last criteria is spelling, punctuation, and grammar. Everyone's favourite, I am very sure. So a medium grade would look like this. The student has used coherent language choices throughout their analysis. Their spelling, punctuation, and grammar is, for the most part, accurate. Some complex sentences are used. So the key words in this particular criteria are coherent, accurate, and complex. Coherent just means I can understand what you're saying in the language that you use. Your spelling, punctuation, and grammar must be mostly accurate throughout your analysis. I expect as Year 11 students, you should be using complex sentences sometimes in your work. Now, if you're not sure about simple sentences and complex sentences, I'll quickly explain to you now what that means. So a simple sentence is just one single independent clause. So for instance, as an example, the author believes that students should be allowed to have their mobile phones with them in class. It's an independent sentence because when I read it out loud, it makes sense all in one go. That's fine. So this is just one sentence with no conjoining words such as and, but, or if. Now, a complex sentence is a sentence that includes one independent clause and one dependent clause. So for example, the author believes that students should be allowed to have their mobile phones with them in class and is horrified that teachers seek to take away this freedom. A dependent clause is a sentence that does not make sense if stated on its own, and an independent clause is a sentence that does make sense on its own. The bold part of this sentence, the second sentence, is a dependent clause, and a good way to check this is to read it out loud. So if I was to read the bold part of that sentence out loud by itself, and is horrified that teachers seek to take away this freedom, I couldn't have that as a sentence on its own. First of all, it doesn't make sense. If I start it with and, or even if I started with is, it doesn't make sense as a sentence on its own. So that is a dependent clause. It's dependent on another clause to make that sentence make sense. I hope that makes sense to you. If not, please let me know and I can give you some more information and maybe some more resources on understanding complex and simple sentences. So there you have it. That's your rubric. But now is your opportunity to self-assess using the rubric. I want you to use the PDF that's attached to this Schoology page, and I want you to identify which grades you think you can achieve on this SAC. You must use Kami to complete this task. When you open the PDF using Kami, you're going to be able to write on the PDF document and use audio or video comments to reflect on your analysis. There are much more comprehensive instructions on Schoology for you, so you can have a little look at that before you get started. Good luck, and I'm looking forward to reading your self-assessments.